Hey Ecofictologists, welcome back to my channel. Today I am super excited to be introducing a couple guests to the channel, one familiar face and one new face. This is Forrest Brown from the Stories for Earth podcast, and we've got Dr. Octavia Cade with us today, which I'm super excited about. And I'll let each of them introduce themselves, I think. So Octavia, do you want to go first?
Sure, yeah, hi, I'm Octavia. I'm a writer from New Zealand. My background's in science, so basically I like to use science fiction to talk in new and hopefully interesting ways about science.
Yes, very interesting and exciting.
And I'm Forrest. I run the Stories for Earth podcast, which is a podcast all about climate change and pop culture. So we talk about books, movies, TV shows, and more.
And links for that will be in the description below. And some of the viewers who are on the Discord server will recognize Forrest from that. We're a happy little community over there. And today we are here to talk about Octavia's book, The Impossible Resurrection of Grief, which, yes, thank you. I was going to ask you to hold one up. Oh, yay, we've got two. I read mine on my Kindle, so I don't have the physical book. But it's such a beautiful cover. I love the cover so much.
It is. No,
it is.
awesome.
Rachel Lobenberg did it to give her the credit. She's done an amazing job.
It's absolutely beautiful.
Awesome.
And it's published by Stelliform Press, and I've given them a shout out on the channel before. And yes, so let's just dive into it. We've got some questions for you, Octavia.
Okay.
Before we jump in, do you want to give a brief kind of spoiler-free summary of The Impossible Resurrection of Grief?
Okay, sure. It's looking at this idea of ecological grief, which is something that is being explored, I think, more and more in the academic world at the moment. It's also something I think that a lot of people really recognise, the idea that we are mourning the world that we have and that we had, the species that are going extinct and dying. I don't know if you remember, but a couple of years ago there was a video of a starving polar bear, which was god-awful. And so it's playing on the idea of this ecological grief for species, for plants and animals that are threatened by climate change and biodiversity loss. And it's sort of pumped it up into this widespread social phenomenon. You know, if you're infected by this sort of souped up grief, you begin to become, more unstable in your thinking. You become less resilient, and eventually it sort of turns to suicide. And the idea of the story is that the main character has her best friend die of grief, and she finds some letters that her friend left behind, and she sort of goes on this wee journey to figure out what's happened, to try and make sense of it all. And along this journey, she finds other people who are struck by grief, who are trying to resurrect various species like the thylacines, and how that impacts the world around them, basically.
It is such a fascinating book. I inhaled it. I read it in like 2 days. It's so good. It's so good.
To be fair, it's also very short, so you can read it.
Yes, it is very short. It is technically, I suppose it's a novella, but it packs the same punch as a full-length novel. This is definitely a hard-hitting novella. And the way that you described how grief is portrayed, and obviously eco-grief and climate grief is a topic that more and more people are talking about at the moment. What made you portray it in this way it's almost a disease as well as a mental state? You can get infected in it and it progresses to this suicidal kind of end.
I don't know. It wasn't a deliberate choice. I think I didn't plan it out in advance. I think what interests me is the idea of it being so systemic, because problems like climate change are systemic. You can't blame them on any one thing. There's a history and a context, and so I like the idea of doing that with the consequences of it as well, because of course the consequences of climate change are systemic. They will reach their nasty tendrils into pretty much every factor of our lives, every factor of our future lives. So I like the idea that, yeah, that it was a system problem, not an individual problem.
Do you think Ecogrief, obviously in the book, for some it completely overwhelms them, and for others it does become this kind of motivator to do something else, and to try and take on these projects like bringing the thylacines back. And do you think that can be true in our real life as well, that Ecogrief can be a motivator? Because a lot of the time it feels very overwhelming, and you feel very hopeless, and then you don't really feel like doing anything. But other times maybe it can galvanize some action.
Yeah, I think because for everyone in this wee novella, the grief is very focused on, one thing. People are they're affected by the loss of one species or one ecosystem. And that is a lot easier to mobilize against than climate change is killing the world. If you can say, look, it is affecting this species in this area in my backyard, maybe there's something I can do about that. But, I live in New Zealand. The starving polar bears are awful, but they're also on the other side of the world.
Yeah.
I'm far more likely to be helpful, to be useful, looking at problems in my own backyard, because those are the things that I can do something about. So I think this personal connection within the novella to what is causing the grief, or not causing the grief in some case. I mean, Ruby, the main character, loves jellyfish, and they do very well under climate change. So
yeah, they're thriving. They're thriving. I did think that was a really interesting dynamic.
Yeah, I hadn't considered that jellyfish might be better off actually if the world got warmer, but yeah, that was interesting to see that in there.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, on the note of polar bears, I feel like I've heard it said before that polar bears now are, while it is tragic and obviously heartbreaking to see those visions of starving polar bears, I've been hearing people say, or I've heard it said, that polar bears are like a really bad image, I guess, to use for climate change communication because of what you were just describing. They're on the other side of the world from you. So it makes it feel like a very removed problem. You were saying like that's why you chose to do specific species, but was that part of your thinking and why you chose to go with, I guess, stay away from things like visions of the Arctic and Antarctica and things like that?
Well, yes and no. The main factor that pushed, the sea witch into the grief in this book is the loss of the Great Barrier Reef. I have never seen the Great Barrier Reef. But if anything were to push me into this sort of state of mental health, it would be the total loss of that ecosystem. And I can't explain it. I've never been there. I don't know that I'll ever go there. And yet that is what has touched me more than anything else, even though there are things in my backyard that...
Interesting.
That will, a couple of years ago down in Wellington, which is our capital city, we have little blue penguins in Wellington living on the coast. Wow. In 2019, I think their nesting season pretty much failed. About a third of the chicks died of starvation because the warming waters in Wellington Harbour aren't supporting the fish that they need to survive. So that is a local thing. And it's terrible. You would think it would affect me more than the Great Barrier Reef because, I've lived in Wellington. I've seen these little penguins walking along the footpath when they sort of get a bit lost. But no. No, it's still the reef. And I think part of that is so much anger, because you see the terrible things that are happening up there, the way that it's been whitewashed out of a lot of environmental reports, because the Australian government is worried about the impacts it will have on tourism. And I just find that immensely frustrating.
That does kind of, I guess, naturally lead into a question I wanted to ask you. There's this phrase that gets repeated in the book a lot. I think Ruby says it the most, and it's, can you watch something die and let it die? I wanted to ask what you thought the answer to that question was, and do you think that, for example, things with the great, like the Great Barrier Reef, is that an example of people watching something die and letting it die? Curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do think it's true. It is demonstrably true. We are watching it happen every day, and I think what I like about that phrase and why it gets repeated so often is it's so blunt. It's the hammer over the head of the reader. It's, no more excuses. This is what we're doing. We know what we're doing. We know that, the penguins in our harbour are starving to death because, the waters are warming and there's not enough fish. We know this. Are we doing anything about, the amount of emissions coming out of our country? Very, very little. So we're watching them die. We're letting it happen. And I think the first step in better behaviour in future is to recognise what it is that we're doing now. Yeah,
totally.
Did you find writing this book cathartic in any way? Like, you obviously have, you have a lot of feelings with these phrases like watching something die and letting it die, and the concept of eco-grief and seeing everything around you, and you come from an academic background, you see all the data. Was putting it down in words in a story some kind of catharsis?
It's one of my rage stories.
Rage story. Those can be very helpful.
And so every so often, the rage story comes out, and I'd like to say that it's cathartic, but I'm still really angry.
I'm still raging.
Don't blame you. Oh my goodness. But I noticed near the beginning of the book, you go out of your way to mention that the grief is affecting indigenous communities particularly bad. Why did you decide to include that in the book?
Because I think it's true, and I think that it's a necessary discussion that we have to talk about, especially from a New Zealand point of view, and to a lesser extent an Australian point of view. But I'm not Australian, and I'm less familiar with Aussie history than I am with New Zealand history. We are a colonial country, and that has had consequences. I think Maori are overrepresented in every negative metric here, and that's not good. It needs to change. But the consequences of climate change have been seen to fall mostly on communities that are already underprivileged. And that is likely to continue, I think, with things like ecological grief. I think that is one of the central ideas of the novella, this turning away, and how easy it is to do, because it is so easy, especially if you are in a group that benefits from the idea of turning away. Most people don't sit down and think to themselves, look, it's in my interest to do this, therefore I will. It's generally, I think, a lot more subconscious than that, but the reasoning is still there, ticking away in the background.
I wanted to take us on a slightly different tact and talk a little bit about science communication, because you have a PhD in science communication. And
I do indeed.
And I wondered what made you turn to fiction as a vehicle for your science communication. Did you feel like the standard way that we scientists communicate was no longer, or never was, sufficient? Or did you want to reach a new audience? Or what made you turn to storytelling?
Well, a couple of things, really. To a lesser extent, I've been a science fiction fan since I was very small, but I never, even though I was, devouring science fiction from an early age, I never planned to be a writer. I always planned to be a scientist. And I was in grad school doing my sciencey stuff. And it got to the point where I could not bear to read another scientific paper because the prose was so awful and the communication was so terrible. And I always think that when people say, well, vaccines cause autism and it's only a theory and climate change isn't real, scientists only have themselves to blame. I mean, it's our fault. We have, from the moment you step into, your first university lab, it's scientific writing, structure your lab reports like a scientific paper, strip out any feeling or emotion or, good plain English. Just make them as complicated and as inaccessible as possible. And the inaccessibility really got to me. I mean, it really makes me angry. It's like scientists have decided as a group, they have decided as a group that science should be inaccessible to people who haven't been taught to think and write like them. It's been a disaster for science communication, I think. And while I was, ranting away to myself, my university, which was Otago University down in Dunedin, they started up a Centre of Science Communication. And I thought to myself, talking about science in a way that people can actually understand sounds like a damn good idea.
What a concept.
Yeah. And so the first year that centre opened, I was there. I'd shifted over into science communication, and honestly, it was such a relief. Yeah, such a relief. And science should not be boring and inaccessible. It's something people are interested in, and they get the interest sucked out because, when they want to go to the primary literature, it is so deliberately unwelcoming to them. And so when I started, writing short stories, more and more I'm writing them about science, about issues in science, the history of science, things like that, because stories are the most accessible form of communication that we have. I mean, right from when everyone is very, very small, nursery rhymes and fairy tales and so on, we are taught to communicate in story. And so that's why more and more of my science communication is through story, because it's something that people can understand and that they want to read. And that is just not the case with the primary scientific literature anymore. It hasn't been the case for generations. And it's a terrible, tragic thing.
I've never thought about that even another scientist would have a hard time reading academic papers.
Yeah, because there's so much jargon. Yeah. So much.
Yeah.
And the more specialized you get, and you cannot really work in science now without becoming ever more specialized, the more specific that language gets, until finally, you're talking to a really small group of people within your discipline.
Have you found that the conversations are different when you talk with readers about your books versus academics about research? Like, is one more enthusiastic than the other? Is one form more effective than the other? Do you get more kind of passion or action out of one than the other?
Honestly, no. Which tells me that, what I actually already know is that even other academics loathe this way of speaking. They're just as sick of it as I am, but there's no way out if you want to publish.
Do you see like cli-fi and ecofiction and just, I guess, nature writing in general, any kind of fiction as a way to kind of cut through that then? Is that partly why you write creatively other than just enjoying it?
Partly, yes. I mean, I do enjoy it, but it is a way to cut through. It's a way to access the wider audience. But it's still there's still this gap. I mean, if I were to do more research on seagrass and write a book about it, say a popular science book about my results, would it be cited in the literature? You know, would anyone be reading it to build off the work that I was reporting in that book? Probably not. I mean, they would go to all the published papers, all the academic presses. And I think that's a difficulty, because although academics might like to read science fiction and they might like to write academically about science fiction, things like that, and popular science, there's still this idea of validity. What is valid to cite and what is valid not to cite, and the gap between them is yawning. And I don't know how it can be bridged.
So maybe a little bit of both then. Near the end of the book, Ruby, the narrator, I guess you're writing through her, but she says, I wondered how many of them there were, how many had taken their griefs and forged it into weaponry, made marvels come from anger, and given their hearts to the dead instead of the living. How many could no longer look in the mirror, knowing what they had done, and how they had thereby impoverished both the world around them and themselves. So I was wondering, like, we get to see some glimpses of what people do with their grief throughout the novella, and of course, like, we know it always ends in suicide, but I'm wondering if you had any ideas about or suggestions about what people can do with their real, like, ecological grief in the real world.
Yeah, get involved. It's easier to be angry than it is to be sad, and while I'm not saying, you know, go out and rage against the machine or anything like that, I mean, anger should not be your default state of being. It's unhealthy. But anger is a motivator. I mean, I know that I write my best stories, I think, when I'm really angry.
It's a rage book.
And, so there are things around you that you can do. You do not have to tackle everything. You are not responsible for everything. Find the one thing that you can do and do that. You know. Yeah, you may not be able to help the polar bears, but you can dig up your own bloody lawn and plant some wildflowers or something, so that, you know, plant some native plants so that the native insects and so on, and that your local birds have, you know, something to fall back on. You can't save the polar bears, you can get rid of your lawn. You may not be able to influence what the Brazilian parliament does to the Amazon rainforests, but you have your own parliament, your own government, and there are nature reserves in your own country that you can stop people mining in if you just lobby enough.
Yeah, and I guess the important thing with all of that is that all of it's connected too, so yeah. I think that's all the questions I had. Did you have anything else?
No, I think that's a really great note to end on. Good little bit of advice. Find your thing, get involved, try to stay motivated. If you can, hold on to it. And read lots of books. Read The Impossible Resurrection of Grief. So, Octavia, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Where can people find you online?
They can find me generally on Twitter at ojcade, and my website is ojcade.com. It's periodically updated. There are a couple of things I still have to add, but never mind. So just thank you very much for having me, for inviting me.
Thanks
and
for
reading the wee thing in the first place.
It's so good.
I thoroughly enjoyed it, so thank you for writing it.
I've been recommending it left, right, and center.
Yeah.
And thank you, Forrest, for joining me for another therapy session.
That's what we've started calling these. But yes, always happy to be part of the therapy sessions. I love it.
They are cathartic. I do really like talking through some of these topics because they're too big to bounce around in my own head. It's nice to talk about them with other people and to get different views and opinions, and I really enjoy it. Okay, well that's all for today, and I will see you next week, Ecofictologists.